Shabbat Shalom, everybody. A very happy Hanukkah to all. I hope you've had wonderful family celebrations. It's common knowledge for those of you who study the Jewish calendar that Parshat Vayeshev and next week's portion, Miketz, always come out and they kind of frame Hanukkah. Typically, Miketz is on Hanukkah. This year, it's just at the 8th day, and it runs into the Hanukkah, so it's just after Hanukkah. But the portions of Vayeshev and Miketz have a much larger connotation other than where they appear in the calendar, which is Hanukkah, because they really speak to the story of Hanukkah in the sense of these betrayals I was talking about. If you read along the little bit that we read today, you saw that there were betrayals by Judah to his daughter-in-law. His sons betrayed their wife, the wife that they ended up in a levirate marriage. They refused to provide children for her in the name of their brother. And Judah refused to give her his third son, which could be justified, but clearly was a betrayal. And then, of course, there was the one who did not betray, which was Tamar. Tamar actually took a risk that she would be burnt at the stake for her supposed crime of prostitution by Judah. And to his credit, when he saw that he had done wrong or he had been caught in his circumstance, he acknowledged it, and he said, "She is more righteous than I am," which is a very powerful story and deserves study all on its own. And then, of course, we have the massive betrayal of Joseph. A massive betrayal of Joseph happens when his brothers eventually, rather than killing him, which they thought they should, sell him to a caravan of Arabs who are traveling the spice road, and he ends up in Egypt as a slave or a captive to be sold on the market. And that's where we start our stories of betrayal, but it's also a Hanukkah story, because Hanukkah was also about a betrayal of values, and within the community in Israel, there were competing ideals and identities for what is a Jewish life. And was the temple meant to be the sacred center of Jewish life in the traditional priestly way? Was it really meant to be sort of in the Greek idea where the gods were present and humanity interacted with the gods differently than the ancient God of Israel? And it was Hellenism and a whole reframing of philosophy and life values, and it was a conflict. And essentially, and don't let anybody fool you, the primary conflict in Hanukkah was Jew versus Jew. Ideology versus ideology, denomination versus denomination. There were other actors. The ruling power was involved, but certainly the Maccabees' revolt was in large part against the army who were in support of Hellenism, which was essentially their state identity of religion and theology. It can be argued it was secular, it was pagan, it was ritualistic, but certainly the temple became the flashpoint because the temple was where you would go to remake Jewish identity by starting with the temple down, from which emanated all ritual and all practice. And defense of the temple was so important, and that's why we have Chanukah. What is Chanukah? It means a number of things. Chanukah means to rededicate or to dedicate. So when we opened our building in 2009, we had Chanukah Tabayit, a dedication of the home, of the temple. And we have a psalm that we say, Mizmor Shir, Chanukah Tabayit LeDavid, a song upon the dedication of the temple to David. So the idea of dedicating a temple and the word Chanukah are synonymous. To dedicate means Chanukat HaMizbeach, dedication of the altar, and so on. So this idea of dedication and the word Chanukah has also been seen as Chanukah means Chanu Chaf He, another way of saying they rested on the 25th, because the 25th of Kislev was the day in which they rededicated the temple, because they finally breached the defenses and took over and started cleaning up the temple. They rested on the 25th, only to discover the destruction that had been wrought, and they had to remake the temple, and they spent 8 days cleaning it and trying desperately to keep their rituals alive, one of which was that the menorah is lit every morning and every evening. That's the menorah in the temple, which has 7 branches. And that's in Parshat Naso, which we just read for the second reading of today. It talks about lighting the menorah. But because they rededicated the temple, and it took 8 days, and there's a lot of conversation about what is Hanukkah. The Talmud asks a very powerful question, which seems simple at first. My Chanukah, what is Hanukkah? It's not clear what Hanukkah is. What miracle are we celebrating? Was it the miracle of rededication? Was it the miracle of victory? Was it the miracle of the opportunity to reestablish your rights and principles and rituals over society? Was it, in fact, the miracle that they found any oil at all? Was it a miracle that the menorah was still in existence? It wasn't Titus's era where the menorah went back to Rome. It was still there. Was it the miracle that so many of us are familiar with, that it was supposed to last for 1 day and it lasted for 8 days, which I will say clearly is a miracle that A, I don't think it's really the miracle. B, it's not the primary miracle in rabbinic text ever. C, it comes into development much later after the story of Hanukkah, almost as a way of bolstering the myth and legend of Hanukkah. But the traditional adoption of the minor holiday of Hanukkah, which has become major in our eyes, but minor in terms of tradition, is primarily a miracle of renewal. Not olive oil that lasted for 8 days that should have lasted for 1. That is a bubba maisa. Without slagging any boobies, that is a bubba maisa. Now, people will get really upset that I'm tampering with the holy, sacred miracle of Hanukkah, but like I've written on Living Jewishly, and you can go read the article, it is very clear to me that young people don't buy into that miracle. Just like young people don't buy into Santa Claus. They like Santa Claus. It's fun to see Santa Claus. But very few people leave their early childhood believing that Santa Claus is real. But if you imagine a society which insists that you have to accept that it's real, because that is the underpinning of a holiday, well, now you understand why there's a rejection of Jewish ideas amongst young people, because they're forced to believe things that they know are not true, and we act like they're true. So we stop acting like they're true. We say that's a nice thought. The real miracle, and there's so many other miracles we could think of. So many other miracles. And my primary miracle is always this one. You ready? Here it is. Take it home. It's a really, really powerful story. It's a great, terrible part of our history. Civil war, bloodshed, strife, return to the temple. What did the Jewish people do with their victory? Did they hold an orange march where they could go and taunt their enemies? Did the religious Jews, so to speak, of the time decide that they would have a war celebration, a victory dance, bring their tanks and their planes and their missiles and march through the street every year on Hanukkah to show their might? Or, no, they made it a festival of light, the most universal festival imaginable. Everyone can participate, everyone can benefit, everyone's heart is glad when they see light in the street. It's a beautiful way to say, enough with war, enough with fighting, enough with denominational conflict, enough with the desire to overlord your values on other people. Live and let live. My light that is out in the world is free. I put it out there for all to see. What a brilliant idea that in ancient times, when it would have been so easy to hold an annual war parade, they chose to have an annual light parade. And that is why I wrote the article called Make Light, Not War. I urge you to read it. And I urge you to go back to your children and say, you know, there's many other miracles for Hanukkah rather than the one that's been promulgated called magic. Nobody believes it. And if you do, good for you. I don't. I didn't when I was a kid, and it stuck in my craw, even as a child, that they couldn't find any other miracle. I don't know why these things bothered me, but when you grow up in a world that is so intense, and you are oppressed into believing the most extreme reasons for miracles, for Hanukkah, why couldn't we just be normal and celebrate because it was an important moment as opposed to because Hashem made magic for us religious Jews? Enough. A real miracle is one in which good things happen and it's good for you. That's what you celebrate. It's like the miracle of childbirth. We know it's science, but it's never going to stop being a miracle. So the story of Hanukkah really dovetails with the story of Joseph and his brethren. Because at the opening of Parshat Vayeshev this week, we have a fascinating conflict revolving around dreams. Joseph comes to his brothers naively, and he says, "Brothers, I've had a dream. I've had a dream." What's his dream? His dream is that there are stars in the sky, and one is burning brightly, and it's me. And of course, children in a family such as Jacob's, first of all, Jacob had 4 wives. So there's 4 sets of conflicts already built in. There's 4 segments in that family. There's no doubt that there was a question of pecking order and hierarchy. And everyone knew that Rachel was Jacob's beloved. I mean, it's clear from the text and the family knowing this. And what else do we know? We know that 2 of Jacob's wives were handmaids. And we also know that Leah was the unloved one. And we also know that Rachel died in childbirth, which means there was a pecking order. And Jacob and Joseph had a special bond, more than anyone. And Jacob makes for Joseph a coat of many colors, ketonet pasim. Joseph has another dream, he tells his brothers. I was in the field, and there were sheaves of wheat, and they were all bowing down to me. Everyone. And they said, "Who, Joseph? Your mom?" "Yeah, my mom was there." "How could your mom be there? She's dead." Now you start to understand what happens when you deal with technocrats. Dreams are not good enough. So what if your dream is not accurate? A dream has to be entirely true? He's dreaming. Why is he dreaming? What is his dream trying to say? What will he aspire to because of his dream? Couldn't they encourage him and say, "Joseph, your mom can't be there, but in your imagination she is. Go for it. You want to be great? We'll support you." No, they shut him down. "Joseph, you're an idiot. Your mom's dead. The dream is false." V'aviv shamar et hadavar. But Jacob, his father, held close the dream. He held on to it. He dreamed along with his child. And he loved him. And Joseph was a challenging character. There's no doubt about it. His brothers hated him because of his dreams. They hated him. He was a good-looking man. He was smart. He took time with his appearance. And his father loved him. And he wore that coat so proudly. One day, Jacob naively says to Joseph, "Joseph, why don't you go hang out with your brothers?" Joseph, I'm sure, is thinking, "They don't like me. I don't get along with them." And Jacob says, No. They're in Dotan. Go to Dotan, find your brothers, and see how they're doing," which is a huge mistake. Because Joseph goes looking for his brothers, and they treat him like a pariah. And when he finally finds his brothers, they decided, here's a moment. They see him in his glorious coat. They see him coming from far away. They see that he's just come from the arms of his father who loves him. And there's a jealousy, and there's a resentment, and there's a whole clan of brothers from different mothers, and there's all the hierarchy, obviously. Reuven is the hierarchy, Judah, and then Levi, Simeon. And they're tough guys. They just finished wiping out a whole city a week ago, last week's portion. They're hardened. They decide to kill him. Reuben objects. Judah objects. Can't kill him. How can we shed blood? We can't shed blood. They have a debate. It's not a debate of whether they destroy Joseph or not. It's a debate how to destroy Joseph. They decide to put him in a pit in the ground and wait and figure it out. And Reuben says, just don't do anything till I get back. While Reuben's away, they decide they're not going to kill him. Fine, we're not going to kill him. They threw him in a pit in which the commentary, Rashi, says very clearly, there was no water in the pit. Great, in other words, he wasn't wet, he wasn't drowning, but there were snakes and scorpions in there. In other words, he might have died. Maybe that was part one. Let's see what happens. Boom. They hear him crying. They hear him upset. They see a caravan coming by, and they sell him to the caravan for some shekels, literally. And Joseph's done. But before he goes, they take his coat. They shred the coat with a knife. They dip it in a goat's blood. And they send it to their father. They don't bring it, they send it to their father. And they say, here's the message. Tell Jacob, we found this coat. We don't know what happened. It looks like Joseph was torn and mauled by a wild animal. We're sorry. So they send the coat, which was the object of their hate, the visual object of their hate. And they said they wouldn't spill his blood, but they spilled blood because they felt so angry. It's a biblical metaphor, the idea that blood has to be spilt. Something had to be sacrificed. And they send that back to Jacob in an act of vile disrespect. And Jacob goes into mourning and depression, and we don't hear much from him for quite a while. In the meantime, we have the story of Judah that we read, I talked about earlier, and then we have V'Yosef hurad Mitzrayma, and Joseph eventually was brought down to Egypt. And he was bought and owned by a very important man, and he ran his entire household. So Joseph got a new lease on life. He was obviously talented and smart and capable, and he became the entire manager of the home. He did everything. In the fields, in business. The only one thing he didn't do, he didn't make himself available to his master's wife for pleasure. But she asked every day, over and over and over. One day, Joseph comes to the home, and the text is very interesting what it says. It says, he came la'asot melachto, to do his work. And the commentaries say, what do you mean to do his work? To do his work? Nudge, nudge, wink, wink? Like to do the work? Or did he come to really just work? The text isn't clear on what happened. And the Midrash takes a lot of time with this story, and it does a lot of interesting things about what happened to him during this work day. Whether Joseph succumbed to the desire of the wife and participated or not is a debatable question. Even the rabbis debate it. And it's very, very much a conversation about what happened. But what happens next is not really up for debate. What happens next is Joseph, at some point, decides, I don't want to do this. He might have started. The rabbis have a whole conversation about why he stopped. He imagined his father, some say his mother, looking at him, and he couldn't betray them. So here's Joseph attempting to get out of the circumstance. He has his jacket on. As he runs out of the house, she rips the jacket off of him. Another jacket ripped off of him. She calls the police. Help! This man tried to rape me, and look, I fought him off, and all he left for me was my jacket. Whose jacket is this? And they said, just like the story of the jacket to Joseph's father, the bloody jacket, in which they said, Dad, please let us know. Is this Joseph's jacket? It is? Okay. Well, he's dead. Here, the jacket remains in the mistress's hand, and she says, whoever's jacket this is, raped me. And of course, Joseph ends up in jail. falsely accused. In jail, of course, we know the story. He interprets dreams. Eventually, he's called to Pharaoh because Pharaoh has a dream he needs interpreted. Now, what happens to Joseph? Joseph is beset by technocrats, people who are following the law. They're following the rules of law. In other words, Joseph, you cannot have your father's affection because Reuben is his eldest. You're not. Rachel is his beloved, but you're not his eldest. So stop acting like you're the most beloved. Joseph, you cannot have that dream. It's impossible. Scientifically, you cannot have a dream. But since when does science interfere with dreams? I don't know, but his brothers refuse it. And they hate him because he has the nerve to have a dream, which is impossible. And they hate him for his relationship. They hate him for all the things that were no fault of his own. And then when Joseph ends up in jail, he ended up in jail because, technically, she had the jacket in her hand. Everybody knew who the wife of Potiphar was. Everyone knew that she had hots for Joseph. Everyone knew that she tried desperately to find a day where there was no one else in the home. It happened that one day. Joseph came to do his work. There was no one else there. That was the moment. And who could argue with her? You could make any accusation you want. You ended up with a jacket. Another jacket betraying Joseph. It's really interesting, though, because eventually Joseph marries that same royal family. Which means that when it was all over, they sort of shook hands and said, well, sorry, we just had to do what we had to do. We had no choice, Joseph. There's law. All we had to do, Joseph, was get you into jail, serve your time, and when you're out of jail, we'll go back to the way it was. It didn't go back to the way it was because Joseph, it turns out, became stronger and greater. And the punishment and suffering that he had in jail only strengthened his resolve. By strengthening his resolve, when he got his opportunity in front of Pharaoh, he triumphed and he became the second in command for the great empire, Egypt. How did Joseph handle the travesty of his brother's betrayal? Now that is a whole other story. Because when you're betrayed by a society or by people you've adopted you don't know, you assume that you'll always be, as they called him, the Hebrew in jail. But when it's your brothers from the same father, you don't expect to be betrayed. No, you don't. Justice is one thing. The way you deal with it is another. We get an insight into the gap between what Joseph felt and what the brothers felt in next week's portion. When Joseph, now the king or second, the grand vizier, king, prince of Egypt, whatever he is, the leader, blocks off the border controls because there's a famine everywhere but in Egypt. Under his management, they were very successful. And the commands to the border control was, if any groups of individuals, of Semites, come down, I want you to isolate them. We want to know who they are. Well, the brothers of Joseph knew that if they went down as a group, they'd be considered maybe a hostile invading force. So they each went to a different border entry, but they were all picked up and they were brought together. And Joseph began his unraveling. And finally, at a moment when they're all in jail, Joseph is listening to their conversation, and they're speaking in Hebrew, or whatever the Semitic language that resembled Hebrew then was. And they say, They said to one another, this is further on in Genesis chapter 42, and this is verse 21, 42:21. They said to one another, "We deserve to be punished because of what we did to our brother. We saw him suffering when he pleaded with us, but we would not listen. That is why this great misfortune has come upon us." And Reuben interrupted them, and he said, "Didn't I tell you not to commit a crime against the boy? You wouldn't listen. Now an accounting is being demanded for his blood." But they didn't realize Joseph was listening. And this changed everything for Joseph. He actually heard his brethren empathize a little bit. Didn't stop them. But now he understood the inner workings of what they wanted to do. They wanted to kill him. And selling him into slavery was another form, but they also wanted to destroy Jacob, their father. And they tried by sending him the bloody coat, because they hated Jacob as much as they hated Joseph. These were grown men. When your brother is suffering and pleads for an end to suffering and you don't listen, it's akin to murder. But interestingly enough, I've always seen the story of Joseph as something that I relate to. And I'm going to share something just extremely personal, but totally appropriate. In years of therapy, I found that conversation with a therapist, which may be really important, one of the things I did was I would be reading and I would bring things that touched me, or articles or references or text, and share them. And the text and reading that most connected me to the history with my father and my community and those who betrayed me was the story of Joseph. And not just any version of it, but particularly, and I hope you go out and buy the book. And whether you understand every word she says or not is not important. You'll get it. It's one of the greatest books ever written on Torah and Midrash and the deepest psychological understanding of human character. And it's The Murmuring Deep by Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg. It's basically Hasidic masters rewritten in a form that really brings it all together. The Murmuring Deep by Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg. And when you read the connectedness between the story and the Midrash and the teachings about Joseph and his father, that was my therapeutic meme. That was my muse. It allowed me to reflect through what I had grown up with, which is Torah and Midrash and all the ideas and identity that were both forced upon me but also welcomed. It gave me healing, not because it felt better, but because I knew I wasn't alone. And let me tell you that when Joseph was betrayed by Potiphar, he was fine with it. Ultimately, that wasn't what destroyed him. He named his children after his dislocation, after his loneliness. One child was named after his loneliness from his family, and the other was named after his overwhelming loneliness of being a stranger in a new land. But Joseph succeeded. What never left Joseph was the betrayal of his brothers. And they did so because technically they felt they had the right. You know why? Here's the teaching we had from the Midrash. And I don't think Midrash is the be-all and end-all, but it's a very insightful way the rabbis tried to make this happen. But they give you an insight into the technocratic nature of the brothers. When Joseph comes to them and says, "I had a dream, and in the dream There were sheaves of wheat, and they all bowed down to me. They came to believe that Joseph actually intended to supersede them. And they imagined in their minds that the way that Joseph would supersede them would be to destroy them. That's what they came to believe. They listened to a man talk about dreams, and they saw him trying to take over their lives and potentially destroy them. And they decided to invoke the law of Rodef, someone who is attempting to kill you. And once they invoked the law of Rodef, they were allowed to, in fact, kill them. The law is clear. If someone is coming to kill you, legitimately, you're allowed to self-defense. This is not just in Jewish law. This exists. This exists in common law, civil law. There are parameters, but it exists. Rodef is a little different in that it says, Habala hargecha hargeo kodem, which means if you're aware someone is coming after you, you can preemptively. That's a whole other conversation, but that's what they did. So what are the rabbis trying to do? They're trying to layer on a narrative in which they're suggesting that the brothers preemptively kill Joseph lest he come after them. Technocrats, following the law. Good for you. Did you hear your brother crying when he was in the pit? Did you hear what it sounded like? Did you hear when he begged to be spared? No. You heard it. You didn't listen. And that is why, we'll talk about this next week, there was no forgiveness. None. You'll read the text. You'll say, Rabbi, look, there's forgiveness right there. No. There was none. There couldn't have been any. You know why? Because they acted without malice. But it's better to act with malice than it is to act with law. That makes more sense to people. You hate me, I understand that. You don't hate me? You're doing this, why? Because you have a technical background, you have a technical dossier, you have the ability to destroy me because technically you can? You don't hate me, do you? No. We're your brothers. We're doing this because it's the right thing. There's nothing worse. That betrayal stuck with Joseph forever. He could not reason with his brethren because they were only interested in rationale, not in empathy. So the greatest betrayal in the Bible ultimately comes down to this. The brothers betrayed Joseph and tried to kill him. He went down to Egypt. He becomes the king, so to speak. And Joseph never again looks for his father, ever. He walks away entirely. He leaves. Once it's over, and the betrayal has happened, it's over. It's only years and years later, 27 years later, that when Joseph's brothers show up and he has an opportunity to unravel the betrayal, that he asks them how their father is. And eventually, once he becomes known to his brothers, he brings his father down. But not a single word is ever spoken about the 27 years. Why didn't you call me, Joseph? You were the king, for God's sake. You could have sent an army to find me. You know where I lived. We didn't know where you were, but you knew where we were. The betrayal was too deep. And Jacob was part of it. We'll continue the conversation. There's a lot more to talk about. But suffice it to say that Hanukkah is a festival in which we don't betray our brethren. Just because there was a victory and there was right does not mean it was might. It was light. Bring the light, my friends. Stop with the might. Shabbat shalom. See you next week. Please join me, page 400, Ein Keloheinu. Ein Keloheinu, Ein Kadoneinu, Ein Kimalkeinu, Ein Kimoshienu, Mi Keloheinu, Mi Chadoneinu, Mi Chimalkeinu, Mi Chimoshienu, Nodel Eloheinu, Nodel Adoneinu, Nodel Imalkeinu, Nodel Moshienu, Baruch Eloheinu, Baruch Adoneinu, Baruch Malkeinu, Baruch Moshienu, Atahu Eloheinu, Atahu Adoneinu, Atahu Malkeinu, Atahu Moshienu, Atahu Shektiru Avosenu, Lifahanecha Eskitores Hasamim. Leman Achayvere Dabrna Shalom Bach, Leman Besadana Levakshatav Loch, Adonai Zlamayatana Naivarech, Samoh Shalom. Please rise if you'd like, page 402, Aleinu, which will be followed by Yortzites and Mourner's Kaddish. Aleinu l'shabeach ladon akol, l'seis gedula yotzer bereshit, shelo asanu k'gayei oratzos, v'lo samanu k'mishpachos adama, shelo samchakenu kahem, v'gahor aleinu k'chol hamonam, v'anachnu korim u'mishtachavim u'modim, lifnei melech malchei hamlachim, hakadosh baruch hu, shechnu teshamayim yozed haaretz, moshe migorim mishmayim mimoji. Ne'emar v'hoyo Adonai lemelech al kol haaretz bayomahu yeh Adonai echad u'shemo echad. I want to thank my dear friends Steve Eidelberg and Lois Bain for a donation made in memory of Hermina Nusia Eidelberg, loving wife of the late Leon Eidelberg, mother to Jackson and Stephen Eidelberg, grandmother to Matthew and Joshua Eidelberg, and great-grandmother to Olivia and Freya Eidelberg. Now, I'm mentioning this not just because we're grateful for donations to the shul and people acknowledging the memory of their loved ones, but also because Matthew Eidelberg was one of my earliest B'nai Mitzvah students, and I'm so grateful that we are still connected after all these years through the magic of Zoom. Well, we're not Zooming, we're broadcasting. But this gives us a chance to reach people who we're not closely connected, but fondest memories imaginable from the Eidelberg family. I've decided to do Yortzites live this week. Some weeks we do, some weeks we don't. And there's a reason for it, and that is because the Yortzite list was inadvertently printed with erroneous information, and I'd rather make sure it's correct. Danielle Rubinger, daughter of Tzvi and Deborah Rubinger, Maurice Abrams, husband of Rebecca Abrams, Harriet Zalkin, sister-in-law of Ann Zalkin, Max Katz, friend of Howard and Gloria Moscow, Lily Gottfried, mother and mother-in-law of Jerry and Estelle Gottfried, Ruth Charney, mother and mother-in-law of Marilyn and David Glick and Alan Charney and Angela Sosno, Lynn Newton, sister and sister-in-law of Gary Newton and Jean Wang, Sadie Langboard, mother of Merle Levine, grandmother of Maura Levine, Albert Joseph Pressament, father and father-in-law of Barry and Carol Pressament, Edward Greenspan, father and father-in-law of Juliana Greenspan and Robert Greenfield, Irving Perlin, father and father-in-law of Shauna Perlin and Paul Bain, Sam Levinson, father and father-in-law of Moti and Toby Levinson, Hannah Beck, mother-in-law of Mary DeVenier and grandmother of Tom DeVenier, Karen Smith, sister and sister-in-law of Robert and Christina Smith. In solemn testimony to the unbroken faith which links the generations one to another, we continue now with Mourner's Kaddish.